Not many priests will ever say this publicly, and most Catholics, no matter how devout, no matter how often they pray the Rosary, are completely unaware of what is unfolding in the spiritual dimension right now. There is a reality operating beneath what we see in politics, culture, and daily life. And according to long experience in the study of demonology and exorcism, that reality is not calm or neutral. It is active, it is structured, it is escalating. For decades, I have studied the theology of spiritual warfare, the hierarchy of fallen angels, and the patterns that emerge during formal exorcisms. I have been present in cases that reveal just how organized and intelligent the demonic realm believed to be within Catholic theology. And what stands out today, more than at any other point in my lifetime of observation, is the intensity and coordination of what appears to be a global spiritual shift. It is not being described here as superstition or metaphor, but as a worldview rooted in traditional demonological interpretation. The central claim is this: what humanity is experiencing is not simply moral decline or cultural confusion. It is being interpreted by some within the Catholic spiritual tradition as a coordinated, long-term spiritual campaign against faith, identity, and the human soul. And what makes this moment different, according to this perspective, is not just the presence of evil, but its organization and acceleration. Within classical Catholic theology, especially in the writings attributed to thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas, spiritual beings such as angels and fallen angels are understood to possess intellects that do not function like human reasoning. They are described as perceiving realities in a more direct and immediate way than humans, not progressing step by step, but grasping patterns and outcomes in a unified act of understanding. From that framework, it is argued that any long-term strategy attributed to demonic intelligence would not be short-sighted, but rather extended across centuries or even millennia. This is where the interpretation of modern history becomes important. The last several hundred years, especially since the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the rise of secular political systems, are often viewed in this narrative as the beginning of a long process of removing God from the center of public and private life. Religion was gradually pushed out of education, governance, and cultural authority. Moral frameworks became increasingly detached from theological foundations. The supernatural was increasingly treated as irrelevant or symbolic rather than real. From this perspective, that phase can be understood as a long period of subtraction. The removal of religious influence from society's core structures. God was not necessarily replaced at first, but slowly pushed out of visibility. Faith became private, then optional, and in many places culturally marginal. That transition in this interpretation was not accidental but part of a broader spiritual trajectory. However, the argument continues that this was only the first stage. In the current era, what is being described is not merely the absence of religion, but the emergence of substitute spiritual systems. In other words, the claim is that secularism alone does not satisfy the human longing for transcendence. As traditional religion declines, new forms of spirituality fill the gap. These include various expressions of occultism, age practices, ritual experimentation, and personalized spiritual systems that exist outside institutional religion. Practices such as astrology, tarot, manifestation culture, and modern witchcraft have moved from the margins into mainstream visibility. They are often presented not as religious or dangerous, but as therapeutic, empowering, or psychologically beneficial. In this interpretation, that shift is not random cultural fashion, but part of a deeper spiritual realignment in which alternative forms of transcendence become normalized. Supporters of this view often point to rapid increases in self-described spiritual but not religious identities, especially among younger generations. They argue that this is not simply intellectual independence, but a search for spiritual meaning outside traditional structures. At the same time, they interpret the growth of organized occult movements and symbolic Satanism as further evidence of a broader spiritual ecosystem expanding into public consciousness. From within this framework, what looks like cultural experimentation is interpreted as spiritual exposure. What appears to be empowerment is interpreted as vulnerability. And what appears to be personal exploration is interpreted as participation in a larger unseen struggle. However, it is also important within this perspective to make a distinction. Not every form of suffering, confusion, or moral failure is attributed directly to demonic influence. Classical Catholic teaching on human weakness, concupiscence, and the effects of original sins already accounts for a large portion of human wrongdoing without invoking direct spiritual agency. Argument is not that everything is demonic, but that certain periods in history may involve heightened spiritual pressure or intensified forms of temptation and deception. It is within this context that claims about the present moment are made. According to many exorcists and clergy who work closely with cases of spiritual affliction, there has been a noticeable increase in both the frequency and severity of reported cases. Individuals who would not traditionally be considered at high spiritual risk are, in some accounts, now experiencing forms of oppression or disturbance that were once considered rare. Interpretation offered is that multiple forces are converging at once. Increased exposure to occult practices, increased participation in sacramental life, and widespread cultural normalization of spiritual inversion. These are presented not as isolated trends, but as interconnected developments that collectively contribute to a heightened state of spiritual vulnerability. In this view, the modern world is not spiritually neutral. It is an environment in which competing spiritual influences are increasingly active, and in which many people are unaware that any form of spiritual conflict is even taking place. And from here, analysis begins to move from diagnosis to explanation. What exactly is driving this escalation? How these influences are believed to operate? And what patterns are being identified by those who study spiritual warfare most closely? What follows from that diagnosis? Within this interpretive framework is a need to identify patterns rather than isolated events. Argument is not that history is random or that cultural change is accidental, but that certain consistent dynamics can be observed when societies move away from traditional religious structures. These dynamics, it is claimed, create openings that are then filled by alternative spiritual systems, psychological vulnerabilities, and in some cases what is described in theological language as preternatural influence. One of the first major patterns identified is the rapid normalization of practices that were once clearly categorized as occult or spiritually risky. Earlier generations, activities such as consulting divination tools, attempting spirit communication, or participating in ritualized symbolic systems outside of established religion were treated as fringe or explicitly discouraged. Today, however, many of these practices are rebranded in therapeutic or entertainment language. They appear in lifestyle content, social media trends, and mainstream media without the same level of caution or theological framing that once surrounded them. From the perspective being presented, this normalization is not neutral. It represents a shift in perception where the boundary between curiosity and participation becomes blurred. A person may begin with casual interest, watching content, reading interpretations, or engaging in symbolic systems for fun, but over time, repeated exposure can lead to deeper involvement. The concern raised in this framework is not simply about individual choices, but about the cumulative effect of millions of individuals engaging in similar patterns simultaneously, creating what is described as a broad cultural susceptibility. Alongside this, another major shift is identified: the weakening of sacramental participation within Catholic communities. Within traditional Catholic theology, sacraments are not symbolic rituals alone, but channels of grace, understood as real spiritual protection and strengthening. When participation in confession, Eucharist, and regular prayer life declines, the argument goes, individuals lose access to what is considered spiritual reinforcement. In this interpretation, that weakening does not remain an abstract theological issue. It is seen as having practical consequences in the spiritual life of individuals and communities. The less frequently people engage in sacramental practice, the more exposed they are considered to be to temptation, confusion, and spiritual instability. Entire regions or populations that move away from these practices are therefore described as experiencing a kind of collective vulnerability. A third pattern emphasized is the increasing inversion of moral and symbolic structures in culture. This does not refer merely to disagreement about ethics or values, but to what is described as a reversal of sacred meaning. Symbols that were once associated with reverence are repurposed in ironic, aesthetic, or confrontational contexts. Concepts that were once universally associated with moral order are reinterpreted in ways that destabilize their original meaning. Within this worldview, inversion is not simply cultural critique. It is treated as a spiritual principle of opposition, where sacred realities are not just rejected, but actively mirrored, distorted, or recontextualized in ways that strip them of their original significance. The concern is not only what is being believed, but how meaning itself is being reshaped. A fourth pattern is the increasing fragmentation of human relationships and community structures. The argument here is that human beings are not designed to exist in isolation, but in relational networks, families, parishes, communities, and shared traditions. When these structures weaken, individuals become more psychologically and emotionally vulnerable. Modern life, with its emphasis on digital interaction, individual identity construction, and constant mobility, is seen as contributing to a state of isolation, even when people appear socially connected. The result is a paradox. More communication than ever, but less deep relational stability. Within this framework, that condition is not just sociological but spiritual, because isolation removes the stabilizing influence of shared belief, accountability, and communal reinforcement of values. The fifth pattern is exhaustion, specifically among those who still actively practice their faith. Within this interpretation, the modern religious environment is not only characterized by external secular pressure, but also internal tension, confusion, and scandal. Constant exposure to controversy, disagreement, and institutional instability is seen as wearing down the emotional and spiritual resilience of believers. This exhaustion does not necessarily lead to immediate abandonment of faith. Instead, it often produces gradual disengagement. Prayer becomes inconsistent. Participation becomes irregular. Commitment remains in belief but weakens in practice. From this perspective, faithful individuals can be gradually weakened without ever formally rejecting their beliefs. When these five patterns are viewed together, the argument is that they form a coherent system rather than isolated trends. Increased exposure to alternative spiritual practices, reduced sacramental engagement, symbolic inversion, social fragmentation, and spiritual fatigue are seen as reinforcing one another. Condition amplifies the others, creating a feedback loop of vulnerability. It is at this point that the interpretation shifts from cultural analysis to explicit spiritual warfare language. The claim is not merely that society is changing, but that these changes align in a way that is strategically advantageous to spiritual deception. Whether one interprets this literally or metaphorically depends on theological perspective, but within the framework being presented is understood as intentional at a supernatural level. At the same time, caution is introduced. Classical Catholic theology also emphasizes that human weakness alone accounts for a vast amount of moral failure. Not every negative trend is attributed to direct spiritual agency. The doctrine of original sin, concupiscence, and free will already provides sufficient explanation for much of human disorder. The argument here does not replace that teaching, claims to operate alongside it, focusing on moments where patterns appear unusually coordinated or intensified. Distinction is important because it prevents the worldview from collapsing into the idea that every struggle is externally imposed. Instead, maintains a layered understanding. Human freedom, cultural influence, psychological weakness, and spiritual opposition can all coexist and interact without one single cause explaining everything. From here, discussion naturally moves toward a more detailed breakdown of what is described as tactical behavior within spiritual warfare language. In other words, not just what is happening in society, but how these influences are believed to operate at the level of individual experience, how beliefs are shaped, how temptations are introduced, and how long-term spiritual vulnerability is gradually constructed without the person necessarily realizing it is happening. That is where the next stage of the analysis begins. Building on that framework, the next layer of analysis focuses less on broad cultural movements and more on how influence is believed to operate at the level of the individual mind, behavior, and spiritual life. Within this interpretation of spiritual warfare, large-scale trends only become effective when they are internalized at the personal level. In other words, cultural shifts are seen as the environment, but personal decisions are where vulnerability either increases or is resisted. The first mechanism described is what can be called spiritual substitution. This refers to the gradual replacement of traditional religious practice with alternative forms of meaning-making that feel spiritually satisfying but are not rooted in the sacramental or doctrinal life of the Church. The concern is not that every alternative practice is consciously malicious, but that it can still redirect a person's spiritual attention away from what is considered a stable foundation. In this view, human soul is not neutral or self-sufficient. It naturally seeks transcendence, meaning, and connection to something greater than itself. When those needs are not met within a traditional religious framework, they do not disappear. Instead, they seek fulfillment elsewhere. This is where substitute systems of spirituality become significant. They provide emotional or experiential responses that feel meaningful, but the argument is that they lack permanence, accountability, or doctrinal grounding. Over time, this substitution is said to create a subtle shift in perception. A person may still identify as religious or morally aware, but their primary spiritual reference points become increasingly externalized or fragmented. Instead of a consistent theological framework, they begin drawing from multiple sources of meaning, each offering partial insight, but no unified structure. The second mechanism is identity fragmentation. In traditional Catholic theology, identity is anchored in a few fundamental truths, created in the image of God, being part of a moral order, and belonging to a community of faith. Within the framework being described, anchors provide stability not only spiritually, but psychologically. When identity is disconnected from these anchors, the result is not pure freedom, but instability. Individuals may begin to define themselves primarily through shifting categories such as emotional, states, social affiliations, or online communities. While these identities can feel expressive or liberating, they are also fluid and often temporary. From this perspective, fragmentation makes individuals more susceptible to external influence because there is no consistent internal reference point. A person who does not have a stable sense of identity is more likely to adapt quickly to whatever environment, ideology, or emotional stimulus is most immediate. This is described as a condition of heightened vulnerability, not because the person is weak, because their internal structure is less anchored. The third mechanism is symbolic inversion at the personal level. Earlier, version was discussed as a cultural phenomenon, but here it is examined in individual experience. This refers to the way symbols, meanings, and moral categories can gradually shift in perception depending on repeated exposure and reinterpretation. For example, concepts that once carried clear moral weight may begin to feel ambiguous or purely aesthetic. Practices that were once clearly associated with spiritual danger or moral disorder may be reframed as expressive, symbolic, or psychologically harmless. Over time, this alters how the mind responds to those symbols. What once produced resistance may begin to produce neutrality or even attraction. Within this framework, inversion is not simply intellectual disagreement. It is a gradual reconditioning of perception. The concern is that repeated exposure to distorted meanings can reshape internal moral intuition, making it more difficult to distinguish between what is considered spiritually constructive and what is considered spiritually harmful within traditional theology. The fourth mechanism is relational weakening, but now focused on personal experience rather than societal structure. Even when individuals remain physically connected to others, the depth of those relationships can diminish. Communication becomes faster but less substantive. Interaction becomes frequent but less formative. From this point of view, relationships are not just emotional supports but spiritual safeguards. In Catholic thought, relationships within family and faith communities reinforce accountability, encourage virtue, and provide correction when a person is drifting away from moral or spiritual discipline. When these relationships weaken, even subtly, individual loses a key form of protection. This weakening does not always appear as conflict or separation. It can manifest as distraction, busyness, or emotional distance. People may still love one another, but fail to engage at the level necessary for spiritual formation. Over time, creates what is described as relational thinness, connections that exist but no longer carry formative weight. Fifth mechanism is gradual desensitization. This refers to the process by which repeated exposure to morally or spiritually questionable content reduces emotional and spiritual resistance to it. What once felt disturbing becomes normal. What once felt abnormal becomes acceptable. What once required justification eventually requires none at all. In this interpretation, sensitization is one of the most effective long-term mechanisms of spiritual weakening because it does not require a person to consciously reject their beliefs. Instead, their internal reactions simply change over time. Moral intuition is slowly recalibrated through repetition rather than argument. When these five mechanisms are viewed together, spiritual substitution, identity fragmentation, symbolic inversion, relational weakening, and desensitization, they form a pattern that operates quietly rather than dramatically. There is no single moment of rupture. Instead, there is a gradual reorientation of perception, priorities, and internal stability. At this stage of the analysis, the emphasis shifts from identifying mechanisms to understanding their cumulative effect. Within this framework, the concern is not that individuals suddenly abandon faith or morality, but that they slowly lose the internal coherence that makes sustained spiritual life possible. This is also where the interpretation introduces a critical caution. Not every psychological shift, emotional struggle, cultural influence is attributed to external spiritual agency. Catholic anthropology already recognizes the complexity of human behavior through the lenses of free will, psychological development, social environment, and original sin. These alone can account for significant portions of human instability and moral failure. However, the argument being presented suggests that these natural explanations do not exclude the possibility of additional spiritual dimensions, especially when patterns appear consistent across populations, generations, and cultural boundaries. From here, discussion begins to move toward the question of acceleration. If these mechanisms have always existed in some form, key question becomes why they appear to be intensifying now, and what conditions are allowing them to operate at such scale and speed in the modern world. If these mechanisms are real in any meaningful sense, whether understood spiritually, psychologically, culturally, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why now, and why with such intensity? From within the framework being developed, there is not a single cause, but a convergence of conditions that amplify one another. The modern world is not only changing in one direction, is changing in multiple reinforcing directions at the same time, creating what is described as a kind of amplification field for spiritual and moral instability. The first major factor in this acceleration is technological saturation, especially through digital media systems designed around constant engagement. Unlike earlier eras, where information and influence were slower and more localized, today's environment is continuous. There is no natural pause between one piece of content and the next, between one emotional stimulus and another. The mind is rarely left in silence long enough to return to interior reflection. Within this interpretation, that constant stimulation is not neutral, reshapes attention itself. Attention is understood as the gateway to formation. What a person repeatedly focuses on gradually becomes what they care about, what they believe, and ultimately how they interpret reality. When attention is constantly redirected, fragmented, and accelerated, deeper processes of reflection and discernment become harder to sustain. The second accelerating factor is the collapse of shared moral language. Earlier societies, even when people disagreed, they often shared a common vocabulary about good, evil, virtue, sin, responsibility, and truth. Today, that shared vocabulary is increasingly fragmented. Different groups operate with entirely different moral frameworks, sometimes incompatible with one another. From the perspective being presented, creates confusion not only in society but within the individual conscience. If there is no stable external reference for moral reasoning, individuals are left to construct morality dynamically, often based on emotional response, social feedback, or personal preference. This does not necessarily produce chaos immediately, but it reduces the stability of moral formation over time. Third factor is the privatization of belief. Religion, when it is present, is often treated as a personal preference rather than a public or communal reality. Faith becomes something internal, optional, disconnected from daily social structures. While this may appear to increase tolerance, it also reduces the reinforcing power of shared practice. Within traditional Catholic thought, belief is not meant to be purely private. It is lived, embodied, and reinforced through community, ritual, and sacramental participation. When these shared structures weaken, belief can remain intellectually present, but practically unsupported. Over time, this weakens its influence on behavior and decision-making. The fourth factor is what is described as spiritual noise. This refers not only to digital distraction, but to the overwhelming number of competing narratives, ideologies, identities, and belief systems available at all times. A person can now access thousands of interpretations of reality instantly, many of them contradictory. This environment, discernment becomes more difficult, not because truth disappears, but because it becomes harder to isolate. When everything is constantly interpreted, reinterpreted, and contested, the mind can lose the ability to settle into a coherent worldview. From this perspective, instability is not just external but internalized as cognitive fatigue. The fifth accelerating factor is what is described as moral fatigue. This is not simply exhaustion from life stress, but a deeper weariness that comes from constant moral ambiguity. When individuals are repeatedly exposed to conflicting moral narratives without resolution, they can begin to disengage from moral reasoning altogether, defaulting instead to convenience, emotion, or avoidance. In this state, moral clarity does not necessarily disappear, but it becomes harder to sustain. Decisions become more reactive than reflective. Convictions become more situational than stable. Over time, this can lead to what is described as spiritual passivity, a condition where belief exists but no longer actively shapes life. When these five accelerating conditions are considered together, technological saturation, collapse of shared moral language, privatization of belief, spiritual noise, and moral fatigue, the result is a system that does not need to force change aggressively. Instead, produces an environment where long-term formation becomes increasingly difficult and where alternative influences can spread more easily without resistance. At this point in the narrative, interpretation shifts again toward lived consequences. The focus is no longer primarily on abstract cultural trends, but on how these conditions are observed in real human experiences, in families, in communities, and in personal struggles with faith, identity, and meaning. This is where the framework begins to connect systemic analysis with observable outcomes. It is one thing to describe cultural acceleration in theory. It is another to examine how individuals actually experience confusion, instability, spiritual disconnection within that system. From here, the discussion moves toward what is described as the most sensitive dimension of the entire analysis: how these broader forces intersect with personal vulnerability, and why certain individuals appear to be more affected than others, even within the same cultural environment. At this stage, the focus narrows from broad cultural forces to something more personal and in many ways more difficult to ignore: why some individuals appear more spiritually and psychologically affected than others, even when they live in the same environment. Within this interpretive framework, vulnerability is not random. It is shaped by a combination of early formation, repeated exposure, and the presence or absence of stabilizing structures in a person's life. Argument is not that people are predestined to collapse or remain secure, but that certain conditions make resilience harder to maintain over time. One of the most significant factors identified is early formation, especially within the family. In traditional Catholic understanding, the family is not only a social unit, but the first environment where a person learns trust, boundaries, moral language, and their understanding of God. When that formation is stable, when children experience consistency, affection, moral clarity, and lived faith, it creates a kind of internal structure that later influences how they interpret the world. However, when that early environment is unstable, inconsistent, or absent, the internal reference points that normally guide moral and emotional development can become fragmented. This does not automatically lead to failure, but it does create a greater dependency on external sources of identity and meaning later in life. Within this framework, that dependency can become a point of vulnerability if those external sources are unstable or contradictory. Another factor emphasized is repeated exposure to spiritually or morally ambiguous environments. Modern life does not present influence in a single decisive moment. Instead, it operates through repetition. Content, ideas, symbols, and narratives are encountered again and again, often in subtle forms that do not immediately trigger resistance. Over time, repetition shapes familiarity. What is familiar begins to feel normal. What feels normal begins to feel acceptable. And what feels acceptable begins to influence behavior and belief without requiring conscious agreement. In this sense, formation is not only about what a person chooses, but about what they are repeatedly exposed to without interruption or reflection. A third factor is the weakening of authoritative guidance. In earlier cultural contexts, moral and spiritual guidance was more centralized, whether through religious institutions, family structures, or community expectations. While not perfect, these structures provided clear reference points for behavior and belief. In the current environment, authority is more distributed and often contested. Individuals are exposed to multiple sources of guidance that may contradict one another. Creates a situation where discernment becomes a personal burden rather than a structure. Within this framework, that shift increases pressure on the individual conscience, which may or may not have the tools needed to navigate such complexity consistently. The fourth factor is emotional isolation. Even in socially connected environments, can now maintain constant communication without experiencing deep relational grounding. Relationships may exist in volume but lack depth, consistency, or accountability. This creates what is described as relational surface area without relational stability. From a psychological and spiritual perspective, this matters because deep relationships provide correction, encouragement, and perspective. When those are absent or weakened, individuals are more likely to internalize confusion or struggle without external grounding. This does not always manifest as visible loneliness, but it can appear as internal fragmentation or emotional instability. Fifth factor is what is described as unprocessed suffering. Many individuals carry emotional wounds, loss, trauma, rejection, failure, that are never fully integrated or healed. In earlier contexts, these experiences were often processed through extended family networks, religious practice, or community life. In the modern environment, however, there is often less structured support for long-term emotional integration. Within this framework, unprocessed suffering does not remain static. It can influence perception, decision-making, and emotional responses in ways that are not always consciously recognized. When combined with the other factors already described, can intensify feelings of instability, confusion, or spiritual disconnection. When these 5 elements, early formation, repeated exposure, and guidance, emotional isolation, and unprocessed suffering, are viewed together, they form a layered model of vulnerability. Importantly, this model does not assume uniform outcomes. It does not suggest that all individuals exposed to these conditions will experience the same effects. Instead, it suggests a range of responses depending on resilience, support systems, and personal choices. This is where the interpretation becomes more cautious again. It emphasizes that human beings are not passive recipients of influence. Even within difficult environments, individuals retain moral agency, the capacity for reflection, and the ability to seek stability and meaning. Nothing in this framework eliminates responsibility or freedom. At the same time, argues that environments can make that freedom easier or harder to exercise consistently, just as physical conditions can affect health without determining it completely. Spiritual and psychological conditions can affect stability without removing personal agency. From here, analysis begins to transition toward consequences at the societal level. If individuals are increasingly shaped by fragmented formation, repeated exposure, weakened guidance, and emotional isolation, then the question becomes what kind of collective patterns emerge over time. And more importantly, what happens when those patterns become widespread rather than isolated? That is where the final stage of the discussion moves next. The broader implications of these trends and what, within this framework, presented as the necessary response to them.